In this lecture, I want to talk a little about interrogations and confessions. My hope is that by the time we finish this lecture, you have a little better understanding of the power that a confession has in court and about some of the ways that confessions are elicited. I joke sometimes with the classes that I've taught that if you take nothing else from my class or from this lecture, I hope that you will understand that no matter what you do, if you are ever questioned by police, the first thing that you do is refuse to answer questions and ask for a lawyer. And if that is the only thing that you get from this class, then I will consider myself to have done a pretty good job. I think you're going to see that as we go through this lecture that it's very easy for people to confess to just a part of an offense that ultimately may result in some significant punishment for them. So just be thinking about that as we sort of move through this lecture. What I'm hoping that by the time that you finish this lecture, you have a better understanding of how police techniques have evolved over time from being more physical and more brutal to more psychological techniques. I hope that you will have developed a better understanding of why confessions are so powerful in court. I hope you develop a better understanding of your Miranda rights and where those came from. And then finally, to be able to understand why a suspect may make a false confession. So when we talk about confessions and interrogations, we're talking about, generally talking about police tactics. And police officers tend to prefer to get a confession from a defendant because it saves them time and helps them speed up the investigation of their crimes. Prosecutors, or those people who are called district attorneys, like confessions because they can almost assure that a defendant will be convicted of the crime if they make a confession. If a prosecutor is able to get a confession entered into evidence, oftentimes they don't even have to take the case to trial. The defendant will go ahead and take a plea agreement because the confession can be such a damning piece of evidence against the defendant. Finally, one of the issues that why confessions are often preferred by the police is that when judges or juries hear a confession in court, they may have trouble discounting that confession, even if there's some evidence to suggest that that confession was false or was somehow coerced by police officers. Part of the issue with confessions, I think you'll see, and if you watch any kind of crime dramas or anything like that, is that all of us have this built-in belief that nobody would admit to a crime they didn't commit. And so jurors and judges aren't really any different. They struggle with understanding why someone would admit to a crime they hadn't committed. When police officers are interrogating suspects, their job is to elicit a confession. And what the research shows us is that about 39 to 48% of the people who are questioned by police make a full confession of their guilt, meaning that they go ahead and admit to everything that the police are questioning them about. Of the group of people who are interrogated by police, another 13 to 16% make some sort of damaging statement or partial admission of their guilt. So they may say that they were involved in at least a part of the crime which implicates them in committing the crime. And so what we see is that about 68% of the people who are interrogated by police make some sort of incriminating statement. And that could be a statement that simply puts them at the scene of the crime, or in which in their statement they acknowledge that they committed some aspect of the crime. So you can see that an interrogation that elicits a confession can be a pretty effective method for police officers to be able to try to solve a crime or to get a conviction for the prosecution. Over the past about 100 years, there has been sort of a shift in the way that interrogations are conducted. And I want to briefly talk about how those interrogation techniques have changed over time. Prior to the 1930s, it was not uncommon for police officers to use some sort of physical violence to elicit a confession. And one particularly salient example of this was in the case of Brown versus Mississippi, which was ultimately appealed up to the Supreme Court and changed the way that officers were allowed to elicit confessions. In the Brown case, there were 3 African American suspects who were questioned about the murder of a white farmer. Those suspects ultimately confessed to the crime, but during the trial it was discovered that the confessions were elicited through the use of severely brutal interrogation tactics. The officers who were questioning these defendants made them strip off their clothes. They were repeatedly whipped and beaten and were told that they would continue to be whipped unless they confessed. In addition to the beatings, one of the defendants was even repeatedly hanged to the point of unconsciousness to try to get him to confess to the offense. These men ultimately acquiesced and admitted to committing the offense, but the case was appealed up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court rendered the opinion that confessions that were elicited by police violence violated the Constitution and could not be used as evidence. So, because of the Brown versus Mississippi case, we've seen some changes in the way that officers are allowed to elicit confessions. Unfortunately, there are still cases where police brutality takes place in order to elicit a confession. And for example, in one of the cases that I've been involved with, a police officer was charged with a federal crime after it was discovered that he had repeatedly struck a suspect who he believed had committed a number of sexual offenses against children. While he was able to get the suspect to admit to the offenses, those confessions were thrown out and he was ultimately charged with a federal crime for violating that suspect's constitutional rights. So apart from those kinds of episodes, in general, since the Brown versus Mississippi case, the officers are not allowed to use psychological techniques to elicit confessions. Because of that shift away from physical brutality to elicit confessions, now we tend to see more psychological techniques being used, and officers are trained in the ways that they are trained in the ways to elicit confessions using psychological techniques. Some of those techniques you may have seen in TV or movies, and one of those you may see and even hear kind of used in everyday language is the good cop, bad cop routine, where 2 officers may interrogate a suspect as part of a team. In this good cop, bad cop approach, you get a quote-unquote bad cop who is the more intimidating and threatening of the 2, and that officer may express his anger towards the to the suspect. He may tell the suspect that he's sure that the suspect is lying and try to intimidate that suspect. After that process takes place, a quote-unquote good cop will express sympathy to the suspect and maybe suggest that the suspect committed the crime for some good reason that makes it more palatable for the suspect to admit to the offense. The research has shown that this can be a decently effective technique to elicit a confession, particularly after the quote-unquote bad cop has left the interrogation room and the good cop has a chance to sort of rebuild or put the suspect back together. In addition to this good cop, bad cop approach, officers are trained in what is called the read technique, which is a technique that police officers use to control virtually all aspects of the interrogation. Some of the psychological pieces of that include a loss of control for the suspect, in which they feel that they are totally out of control of their environment and their situation. Part of the ways that officers use this loss of control is to interrogate the suspect in a small room where the officer can manipulate how close they are to the suspect in order to potentially intimidate the suspect into giving a statement. Another psychological technique that officers use when using the read technique is to isolate the suspect from others who may provide that individual with some support. So if there are a group of defendants and maybe 2 or 3 of them are being questioned about the offense, officers will typically take each of those suspects and interrogate them individually to take away that sense of social support they may have if they are with their peers or with their co-defendants. Another sort of psychological aspect of the read technique is that the officers will come into the interrogation room and essentially tell the suspect that the officers know that the suspect committed the crime and that they are certain of that suspect's guilt, and that the suspect has no way to talk their way out of the offense because the evidence against them is so strong and so overwhelming that the suspect might as well just go ahead and admit to the offense. Often as part of this, the officer may even lie or make up potential evidence against the suspect in order to get that suspect to admit to the offense. One sort of final psychological aspect of the read technique is for an officer to provide what are called exculpatory scenarios, which is really just a fancy way of saying that the officer will provide some rationale for the suspect that might justify the suspect's actions. So, as a hypothetical, if a husband were accused of killing his wife, the interrogator might provide the exculpatory scenario that the husband was justified in the murder because the wife had enticed him into, by nagging him, or had created a scenario in the home where the husband was justified in the murder, to get the suspect to go ahead and admit to the offense.